Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm David C. Brock, Curator and Director of the Software History Center at the Computer History Museum. During the ongoing pandemic, while the physical doors to the museum remain closed, our digital doors are wide open. In addition to these live events, you can find many more offerings and resources on our website at computerhistory.org and on our YouTube channel. To stay informed about our latest events, exhibits, and offerings, visit computerhistory.org/subscribe. The museum's work is made possible through the generosity of our members and donors. During these unprecedented times, we need your support more than ever. To help, visit computerhistory.org/join. During the event today, and with the online recordings afterward, we'll be sharing a link to a very brief survey. We'd be grateful if you'd consider giving us valuable feedback by filling it out. CHM's mission is to decode technology for everyone, its computing past, digital present, and its future impact on humanity. Today's event, Decoding Innovation, the Innovation Delusion and the Maintenance Mindset, directly serves this mission. We're very pleased to present the program in partnership with IEEE Spectrum, the flagship publication of the Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers. Without doubt, technological innovations are tremendously important. We hear about innovation everywhere, in books, magazines, white papers, blogs, classrooms, offices, factories, government hearings, and more. But for all this discussion, do we really have a good understanding of what innovation means and its proper place in society? Is the new always good? What about taking care of and maintaining things that already work? To decode innovation, Jean Kumagai, senior editor of IEEE Spectrum, will explore these issues in conversation with Lee Vinsel and Andrew Russell, historians of technology and the authors of the new book, The Innovation Delusion: How Our Obsession with the New Has Disrupted the Work That Matters Most. Welcome, Jean, Andy, and Lee.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Dave. That was great. Lee and Andy, it's great to see you. So love that the Computer History Museum could facilitate this conversation. I'm guessing some of the people who are tuning in know of your work, but many of them won't. So let's start off by, if you could just give us a little background about how you got into researching maintenance and how you came to write this book, The Innovation Delusion.
Yeah, so it really started off as a joke, literally as a joke. The book, The Innovators: How a Group of Hackers, Geniuses, and Geeks Created the Digital Revolution, had just come out, and Andy wrote me and another buddy an email. I should say that for a variety of reasons, we thought that that book had some problems, including because it was so focused on kind of the shiny and new. And so Andy wrote my buddy and I an email and said that we should create a counter volume, which would be called The Maintainers: How Bureaucrats, Standards Engineers, and Introverts Create Technologies That Kind of Work Most of the Time. And I basically started playing with that on a blog and on Twitter and stuff, and it really took off with our community of historians and sociologists of technology and kind of took on a life of its own. And then in 2016, we held our first Maintainers Conference. We've now held 3 of them. And the same day the first conference started, our essay came out on Eon titled Hail the Maintainers. And then with that kind of dual thing, the conference and the essay, it kind of took off even more and kind of went viral, and it ended up getting written about in The Atlantic and Le Monde and Guardian, and we started getting emails from all over the world. And it eventually led to several more things, including writing this book. So I like to tell that story both because it's kind of, it wasn't really like we really planned on doing this. We kind of fell into it and it kind of just took over more and more of our lives. But also what I like is that I sometimes think of it as kind of like the fellowship of the joke. What I most like about the idea is the work it does for other people. You know, when Andy and I talk to people about this idea, they end up coming forward and telling us about, you know, how it plays out in their lives, all the maintainers in their lives, whether it's their uncle or their mom or whoever. So I really like to see the work the joke does for other people as much as, you know, Andy and I like talking about it ourselves.
Yeah, actually, one of my favorite passages in the book is where you show up at a company retreat for General Electric, and you're kind of hanging out with the engineers and other folks. And I think one of the things that I like about that was at a moment in time when GE was going through, you know, briefly flirting with becoming a fail-fast company after 124 years or something. And what I love about that story and about the maintainers generally is that you are taking the time to sit down with the rank and file. You know, it's not just, you know, there's so much focus in our society on innovation and people coming up with bright and shiny things. But, you know, most of the people in the world are not doing that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. You know, when we talk to people about technology, typically sometimes we need to remind them that not all technologies are new. So it's not all digital. Technologies are wood and steel and concrete and glass. And most people's stories, most people's interactions with those technologies, they're not making anything new. Sometimes they're being a little bit creative, like making shelves, like I do at home, very simple stuff. But usually it's maintenance or repair work. It's polishing the wood, it's cleaning the glass, it's making sure that the concrete floor isn't too slippery. So it's really easy to talk to people about this because everybody's experience connects with it. You know, the biggest challenge in writing the book was to pare down the number of stories, to be honest. There's so many great anecdotes and stories that didn't make the cut because we wanted to keep the volume readable and slender, but it's really been mind-blowing how everyone can connect with it.
Yeah. Yes, I will say the book is a delight. I mean, it's a fun read, and it's also just very bracing. You know, it's coming from somebody, you know, I spent my life doing tech journalism, and you know, IEEE Spectrum, you know, we do our fair share of celebrating the new and the people who create the new. But you know, you do this for any amount of time, and you've actually been through multiple generations of the new, and you see over time, like, well, there's the larger problems, and you know, is the new actually kind of fixing those problems? Well, no, there's a lot of stuff that's still just hanging around, hasn't been solved. So in the book, you do spend a certain amount of time defining terms, like innovation. There's innovation speak. There's actual innovation. Can you just kind of go into that a little bit? Because some people kind of might want that.
So we created this distinction a long time ago between what we call actual innovation, which is the process of introducing new technologies, business models, things into the world, versus innovation speak, which is how we've come to think and talk about these things. And for us, this is a really critical distinction for a number of reasons. First of all, we're not anti-innovation. You know, Andy and I are glad to have antibiotics and running water and Zoom and all these things. And we want to make that clear. But also, I like to make an analogy with kind of scientific theories of the world. It's easy for us to realize that there's a difference between the world and scientific theories of the world, and that these things don't always line up, right? Because we have a whole history of scientific theories we don't believe in anymore. And when we tell the story in the book of the rise of innovation speak, how we've come to think and talk about innovation, we want to make clear that there's good reasons to be very skeptical that aligns with innovation. And in fact, there's not great evidence that innovation theories, innovation speak actually leads to more innovation. So that's one problem, is it doesn't even get us what we're trying to shoot for. And meanwhile, it's also distracting us from these really important things like maintenance and repair and just keeping things going.
And then, I mean, Andy, you talked about just technology. And again, there's, you know, people talk about technology, they talk about tech, and they think maybe digital, something digital. They think of something, you know, created in the last decade maybe. But as you say, so many things are technology, right?
Yeah, you know, we're drawing on a pretty long tradition of scholarship, particularly in the history of technology, about technological systems. And these things have beginning stages from invention and innovation through deployment, incremental improvements, use. Historians of technology in the past couple of generations have really focused on use. But not many people have noticed the decline, you know, with some exceptions. Like there's a great book about the fax machine by Jonathan Cooper Smith, which tracks the life history of the fax machine. So yeah, it's really important for us to bring out that we're standing on this body of scholarship that is really about a holistic look at technologies. In getting that right, in understanding the history, and getting the definitions right, as you and Lee were talking about, is really an important first step for getting the next things right, which aren't necessarily history, but which bring us more to what can we do today, and what should we be demanding of other people around us, whether it's companies that we buy things from, or our elected officials, or our colleagues in places where we work. So so it really is about, you know, accuracy and rigor in the history and in definitions about things like innovation, innovation speak, and then into maintenance and other related concepts like repair and care.
So one of the words that also rides along with innovation these days is disruption and disruptive innovation. And I actually had to look this up, but it's been 25 years since Clayton Christensen and his folks started using that term. So it's no longer new, but it's remarkable. It's had this remarkable life where it's in certain sectors of the tech industry, it's almost like a business model now, just be disruptive. So why is disruption in and of itself like just not something that we should necessarily focus too much attention on?
Yeah, I think there's two sides of it. So let me focus on the Christensen side, and then I'll turn it over to Andy to talk about systems. But I think one side of it is just that when social scientists went back and looked at Christensen's data, they found that you know, only like 9% of the cases that he claimed were disruption actually fit his own definition of disruption. So in a lot of ways, it's just a bad theory about how the economy works. And I think there's no evidence that that, for instance, focusing on disruption has actually led to more disruption. We haven't necessarily seen more disruption as it's become a really hot term in Silicon Valley, especially. So I think that that's kind of the first half, and then there's a bigger question about like systems. So let me turn it over to Andy for that part.
Yeah, so you know, both Lee and I are historians of technology, and we've focused in our respective first books on standards, which is, you know, often seen as the boring cousin or the boring underbelly of technological development. But what it raised in both of us is an appreciation for how slow and labor intensive the work is to develop technological systems. And it rarely proceeds in a flash, right? It rarely is just something happens at once. Disruption can be seen in certain systems or in certain industries when you look backwards. But like Lee said, you know, the evidence bears out that someone going into something to try and disrupt it probably doesn't know what they're talking about, because they're probably under underestimating or just misconceiving the nature of the system. So for example, it's not from computing, but think about the Hyperloop. There's been a lot of talk about Hyperloops recently. It's fine to do a demo and send one of these things down a track that's 100 yards or whatever it is, but to actually disrupt mass transit, just think about all of the systems that have taken root over centuries or more, involving so many people and machines and time. And so to think that an entrepreneur and a bunch of their buddies can just disrupt that is just misunderstanding the world around us.
Well, to play devil's advocate, they might argue that there's just a lot of bureaucrats standing in their way, and why won't they just, step back and let this obviously superior technology advance?
Yeah, that's what they do argue. And there was an article I used to use in talks and classes about these Silicon Valley guys who wanted to start whole new cities from the ground up, because they were just so fed up with cities as systems, both politically and technologically, that they thought the only thing you could do is kind of libertarian like fantasy of starting from scratch, right? And I think that, this is where I'm a historian of regulation. Andy wrote about technical standards that were realized through voluntary processes like the internet. I'm a historian of regulatory standards in the automobile. And I just think that there's a lot of times we underestimate why those rules are there in the first place and how we got there and why the kind of regulatory state has developed. And I think you can see it with like Uber and Lyft and other ride sharing things, that the problems that have developed around it are not that surprising when you realize that their whole goal was to kind of like circumvent regulation in key ways.
Yeah, and these things encode and encapsulate, whether we're talking about technical standards or laws or both, they encapsulate experience and they write it in the most efficient shorthand that their creators know possible, so that people can move on, so that we don't have to rehash all of the stories that led to why we have seatbelts or why we have 802.11 or things like that. So to think that someone can just march in and wipe that away to make room for my new thing, not only is it kind of an inaccurate picture of the world, there's something in there that's disrespectful toward past generations and all of the experience and all of the effort that they put into making something as simple as possible. And so that kind of hits a soft spot in Lee and I, because it's that level of respect that we're trying to bring to the surface throughout the book and everything that we're doing here.
Yeah, so I guess just getting back to the central thesis of the book then, so can you, in 30 seconds, summarize, what is the main thing that you want people to get from the book?
I think it's about balance ultimately. And I think Andy and I only realized this after like writing the book and talking about it for a long time. I think that, I've already kind of outlined the history of innovation speak. I could say a lot more there, but like we have come to talk and think about technology in this kind of historically, dependent way. We didn't talk this way 50 or 60 years ago. Now we talk about this way. Where did it come from? And that leads to a number of problems, including just people wasting money on design thinking classes or whatever. But I think, the bigger message of the book is that there's this whole other side of technology, maintenance and repair, that are really important that we often neglect. We often neglect the acts themselves, and then we often fail to give recognition to the people who do that work. And I think that's the end of the story. And then really it's about how to rebalance the way we think and talk in organizations and policy in our individual lives, so that we pay more attention to these things that we often undervalue. Andy, did I get that right?
Nailed it. Yeah. I mean, it was really important to us to end the book, not just end the book, but have a substantial portion of the book reinforcing this positive message that Lee said. You know, we're not just nagging people who say innovation too much or spout all these buzzwords that you hear in business. There's really a positive vision that we have and that we want people to connect with. And so the last 4 chapters of the book and the epilogue really spell that out.
Sometimes we get kind of like lumped in with the so-called techlash, which is like beating up on Silicon Valley firms or whatever, you know, and be a lot of skepticism around, you know, the FANG companies, Amazon, Facebook, and Netflix, and all these things. And there's certainly, I think we're certainly critical of certain threads of Silicon Valley thinking and culture, like many other people in our field. But for us, it was really important that it wasn't just that there was this whole other side of the book that really was a more positive vision.
So can we talk a little bit more then about maintenance and care? Care was something that was not originally part of the maintainers, right? It kind of, you sort of, like, at what point did you weave that in?
Boy, that's an interesting question. You're right. Gene, I think you were at the first maintainers conference. Is that right? Back in 2016? Or maybe it was 20...
I was trying to remember, was I there or did I mean to go? I should have been there.
We felt you there. Yeah, you know, we've benefited tremendously from the community of scholars who write about these things, some of whom who have presented their work at the 3 conferences that we've had. And we've learned so much. And that was really one of the things, for me anyway. Lee's background is a little bit different than mine, but I hadn't really encountered the literature from feminist philosophy on the ethics of care. And there was a pretty strong literature in maintenance and repair studies that was drawing on the ethics of care. And for me, when I encountered that literature and spoke to some of the people writing that stuff, it just clicked into place for me that care really is an animating spirit of maintenance. Lee, how do you remember it? It's an interesting question.
I think that's the right way. I mean, I think it's learning a lot from the community. And I also think, you know, to connect it back to what I just said about balance, I mean, think that focusing on care as a kind of end value, you can say, well, if I'm giving care to a system or to a person, it might mean introducing new things, right? Innovation is part of that picture. But there's really also so much caregiving, you know, to children, to elderly parents, to ourselves, that's focused on just maintaining and keeping things going. So it's a way to talk about values and balance in the world, I think. That includes physical things. I think we want to, you know, and we want to focus both on people and things in a kind of holistic fashion.
Yeah, I mean, there is this really important element of emotion in care that's not necessarily in maintenance or really in innovation. I mean, it's, you know, emotional labor and just things of that nature, you know, the negative and positive sides of that. And it kind of made me wonder, like, should maintenance have, I mean, should we recognize that there is like an emotional component to, maybe this is getting in the weeds, but, you know, the people I know who are really doing like pretty hardcore maintenance, they are very passionate about what they do. I mean, they are very emotional, emotionally kind of engaged in their work. And it just, yeah, maybe that doesn't kind of get recognized enough.
Yeah, I mean, one of the stories in the book that we tell is about a guy named Juris Milestone, who's an anthropologist at Temple, who's presented papers at the maintainers. That's how we met him. And Juris told us how he also fixes motorcycles as well, and cars. You know, he has a fleet of like half broken stuff around his house, I think. And the story that he told us was that when he was young, his first exposure to these things was in his mother raised him alone, and she had a group of hippie friends that they all hung out. And one day he was hanging out in a garage with someone who seems to me to be like a father figure, certainly a trusted adult, in a shop, in a repair shop. And, you know, we could tell from the interview that that was really meaningful for him. And then just the joy that he recalled from that experience. He told us about the guy put him in a 55-gallon drum that would go up to the ceiling of the shop and could move. It was on tracks to kind of move heavy stuff around, and gave him a joystick, like a like a video game joystick. And Juris just played, you know, and so there's an effective dimension there that you can't really capture from just saying, here's someone who works in motorcycles. It really does have deep meaning for people, not only in terms of the work that they do, but who they are. It's really about identity in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, I think it's about, there's a level of craft and mastery, like people have, they know that they're good at something, and then that's valuable. And then for a lot of maintainers, it's also about helping, right? Because like, you're in service to something else, other people, the organization. And so there's a kind of support, caregiving role there, whether we think about it that way or not. You know, a lot of these people, we talk about the book Quiet about introverts. You know, a lot of these people are kind of introverted, but they like being in that support role. And I think one reason why it's so important to focus on this affective dimension, and Andy really wrote that chapter and really captured the emotions well, I think, is that, you know, because in education, we so focus on innovation and getting kids into coding camps and like robot competitions and all of these things, and sell them this notion that they have to be innovators, when in fact, most of them will graduate, 70% of them will graduate from engineering programs and become people in operations and maintenance. It's to show the kind of positive vision of what they will probably be doing in life, right? Because I think we so often kind of give them a false idea of what engineering and other technical fields, for instance, are. There's a lot to be gained from being a maintainer.
Yeah, and yet it's, I mean, just, I'm trying to think of like, how would a tech publication like IEEE Spectrum, how would we sell, you know, the story of maintenance? How do you kind of, it's kind of easy to make a story about like coming up with like a great new product, like very sexy even, and talking about maintaining a product like 20 or 30 years down the road, it's like, it's a little bit of a harder sell.
It might, you know, I've looked at IEEE's awards before, and other engineering societies awards they give out, and they're all very invention focused, as you'd imagine, and to some degree rightfully so. So there's a group of librarians that are about to hand out like a maintainers award, and I've often thought about like, what if we started awarding these kinds of acts within professional societies and other things, the maintainers awards? What would those stories look like that people would pitch to it? I think that would be a kind of creative way to maybe start finding other stories about engineering life.
That's we have a great idea.
We have in the I'm at a SUNY campus, State University of New York, and the chancellor of the system has several kinds of chancellor's awards for teaching, for service, for research, and there's one for professional service. And last year, one of the plumbers got the award for professional service. This was in the time when we were all in the field house and eating and enjoying each other's company. And that was by far the most touching moment of the ceremony, was hearing the person who nominated him talk about what his work meant to the students. So, you know, if you've been in a dorm, you know what happens if a sink breaks or the shower leaks or the toilet clogs. And there's one person that comes to the rescue on our campus here, and that's the plumber. And so for him to be recognized in front of everybody, like I said, it was really moving. And as Lee alluded, there's a tone there that I think, you know, a lot of professions and professional societies would do well to mimic. And, you know, I'm not the editor of Spectrum, but I could imagine ways to adapt that ethos into articles that you would write.
Yeah, it's definitely worth exploring that a lot further. So I guess in the vein of maintenance, can we talk some about deferred maintenance versus kind of preventative maintenance, maybe in the context of, I don't know, like infrastructure really unsexy infrastructure. But
You want to tackle that, Eddie?
Sure. So, I mean, the historian in me has to point out that deferred maintenance arose first as a category, as a term of art. It was early in the 20th century when engineers started talking about that. Preventive maintenance happened, and predictive maintenance happened later. Once once the profession wrapped their arms around the fact that they could stop things before things broke. So, to put it in a contemporary lens, I think it's a matter of attention. So if we're thinking about an infrastructure, let's talk about, a campus network, for example, since I'm relying on it right now. A deferred maintenance approach would just, run it till it breaks, or, we don't worry about it and we'll deal with the costs of something breaking down afterwards. Where preventive maintenance would be a little bit more structured. You'd have a schedule for checking and testing and replacing different components. And it's just it's a rational approach to managing a system or a network or an infrastructure. So the obvious question to ask is, what are the costs involved in doing that? If you're the CIO, say, wouldn't it just make sense to not bother with all the planning and testing and certification or replacing things before they're broken, and just run it down, and then someone will complain and then we'll fix it? But people have studied this, and the cost savings of preventive maintenance, of fixing things before they break, are in the triple digits. One study that we cite in our book puts a 545% return on investment for a thoroughgoing preventive maintenance regime. So a $5,000 fix saves $200,000 on downtime, lost productivity, customer irritation, which can play itself out over time. They might go somewhere else, or our students might transfer. We might get a bad reputation for having a terrible network. So when maintenance and facilities professionals think about these things, those are the sorts of trade-offs that they need to make.
I think in terms of like the sociology and economics of maintenance, one fascinating thing is that there's industries that really have preventive maintenance down, and then there's industries where it's just like not there at all, basically. So, in the petroleum and refining industries, for instance, there's very refined cultures of maintenance and preventive maintenance and turnovers and all these kinds of ways. And it's because they really long time ago, they realized that uptime and dependability were crucial for their profitability when they're playing with really thin margins often. And then if you think about a different kind of case, the kind of tech startup Gridium, which is a maintenance repair company focused on sensors and smart buildings and stuff. Their folks did a study of building maintenance, the work orders people put in for building maintenance, and found that it was over 95, it might have been 98% of building maintenance work orders were reactive, meaning they were repair focused, right? So you have two completely different cultures of maintenance repair, buildings versus refineries. And then, lots of industries are somewhere in the middle there, but there is no kind of, even within industries, and you look at different firms, there's no kind of stability or homogeneity there. It really is very mixed out there in the world, where we're good at preventive maintenance and where we're just basically doing repair work when stuff falls apart.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we've looked at a lot is just a legacy IT. So IT is one of those areas where things have been allowed to kind of drift and drift and drift. And now there's these decades old systems that are very difficult to maintain, very costly to maintain. Many of the people who originated them have retired or moved on to other things, other projects. And what is to be done there? There have been various studies that show that, the bulk of spending these days on IT does not go into like new systems. It goes into just maintaining the old, hard to maintain systems.
So yeah, I mean the latter part of what it's a really good question. It's a really tough problem, and the problem shows up when things don't get done, like when people don't get Social Security checks or various things. And you pointed at, I think the dilemma is that do you chase after fixing the old thing, or do you bear the costs of ripping it out and trying to replace it anew? You know, there's no easy answers there, but I guess what I would say would be to kind of shift the question, the discussion a little bit, and to say that we know that these things are going to happen because we have experience with it on other scales. And that's something that we try and do in the book, is to point out how the problem like the legacy IT problem in organizations has a lot of things in common with the national infrastructure problem, where we have a D plus. You know, American infrastructure is consistently rated a D plus by the civil engineers, the American Society of Civil Engineers. And it's a problem that we all know personally. So think about reframing that question. You're not talking about legacy IT. Let's say you're talking about your sore knee, or some aspect of your diet, or some aspect of your kitchen sink. We know better than to just run it into the ground, and we know that we should keep up with it incrementally before the problems get too big, before you have to get your knee replaced. You should exercise and do your physical therapy, as the case may be. And so, you know, I'm not trying to duck the question about legacy IT because it's such a hard question, but I think I'm trying to bring out one of the things that that we hope readers will take away from the book, is that we're not proposing some new theory. We're asking people to pay attention to what they already know from their personal lives and from the data that's around them and the experience of other people, and be thoughtful about applying that. Both individually as well as in the collectives they inhabit, in organizations and as citizens or residents in their community.
I think one of the things we try to bring out in the book is we want people, including in organizations, to really think about the downstream maintenance costs of systems, because we hear so often. You can also apply this to national infrastructure, like Andy was just outlining. But I think that we hear so often from organizations that people just aren't really considering what are the downstream costs of adopting a system, for instance. They often kind of underestimate how expensive it will be to have a software system or whatever on hand. I think legacy IT is often like the flip side of that, right? It's like thinking about the system and keeping it and what the downstream costs are with that, and you get stuck with it, stuck with that. I think one interesting thing is that, you know, whenever we talk to computing, you know, Andy and I know a lot of old time computer folks and computer historians, and who had earlier lives in the industry, and you bring up maintenance around them and they just regale you with stories all day long. The computing industry is one place where people realized maintenance costs were huge really early on. Since the 70s and 80s, the estimates for software, for instance, have been, you know, between 60 and 80% of budgets and effort are going into maintenance as opposed to design and implementation. And I also think you know, just to give a little hat tip to the Computer History Museum, I think you see it come out in their oral histories and other places where you talk to computer people, you know, like, or NASA scientists and people, they'll tell you that a huge amount of their effort goes into maintenance work.
Yeah, actually, I mean, it's also true, though, that the maintainability of something, or the extent to which it can be easily upgraded, is or should be part of the design from the get-go, right? And I guess, so what is the what are some of the downsides from, you know, a lack of attention to maintenance and care? Some of the concrete things that happen to us as a culture, or, you know, in certain industries or what have you?
I mean, the most jarring ones and poignant ones, I'll start there. There's a lot, you know, so is that people get sick, people die. If, for instance, water infrastructures or sewer infrastructures, whether it's in cities or in homes, aren't designed appropriately to ensure people's health. That's kind of the most I think distressing part of it, but there's effects at the system level as well and at the organizational level. Lee, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can think of a lot of, you know, cases of just crumbling infrastructure, people dying from fires in subways, bridges collapsing, and then apply that to, as Sandy's saying, we can also talk about the lack of septic tanks in the Black Belt in Alabama. So there's lots of stories like that, you know, at the home level too. We talk about critical home repair in one part of the book, which is repairs that have to happen to a house or it becomes dangerous to live in. And it's a real problem throughout the whole United States right now. And then, you know, on the corporate level, it's just about like things like profitability and reliability and all of these things, right? If you don't have a healthy culture of maintenance, it really cuts in to your bottom line. I wanted to go back. Gene, you said something about maintainability. I think that's really an important topic. So I think, you know, we can design things to be maintainable, and we should, including for the environment, right? Because we've become such a disposable culture. But I think that there are a lot of times we lack the incentives, the economic incentives for firms to do that. So I think about like the right to repair movement, and you know, the whole movement to make corporations make things, open up their repair plans and make them repairable to us, or at least allow us to repair them when they lock that down. And, you know, I mean, I won't call out individual firms on this particular call, but I think that like we see the companies have an economic incentive to actually make their products not repairable, you know, and to really, for the companies, it's the best thing is if it's their product speeds its way to the dump, because then we'll buy a new product to replace it. And they're really stuck on that kind of growth and replacement model. So I think as a culture, you know, I saw one factoid like you spend more energy is spent building a cell phone than charging one for 10 years, right? As a culture and environmentally, it's really important for us to find kind of new economic models for dealing with maintainability and finding ways with policy to encourage maintainability.
Yeah, I mean, agree 100%. And I really like the way that that Lee put that. I think the thing that pulls all these together is to get back to your question, that the costs of undervaluing maintenance and care is that it compounds existing injustices. So whether if it's a kind of environmental injustice that that Lee was talking about, or if we look at the people who are overwhelmingly performing maintenance and care work, especially care work, it's women, it's unpaid work, or it's underpaid work. It's people of color, typically women of color. And so, you know, to undervalue maintenance and care is to, you know, systematically disadvantage a group of people. And that's just not right. You know, so it's, I agree with Lee, you know, if you're a corporate manager, you're thinking, well, how am I going to increase my profits and return more money to my shareholders? But there's more at stake than that. And I think that's important not to lose sight of that.
Yeah, we try to draw that out in all the chapters, that whether we're looking at the lives of maintainers or maintain stuff in infrastructure, it falls right down around like classic inequalities around gender and race and all these things. Like maintenance and maintainers and the problems there are like a mirror image of the problems in our society. And that's not altogether surprising.
Are there companies or institutions that have actually excelled at maintenance, not just as that's because they're what they do for their business, but just it's part of their corporate culture or what have you?
100%. This is, and this is, the last few chapters of the book. So, Lee, do you want to start and then I'll chime in?
I want you to talk about Amazon Web Services and Netflix for a second.
Yeah. So everyone freaked out a couple days ago when Amazon Web Services, one of their servers went down for a couple hours. Sorry if this was painful for people who are tuning in here, but that downtime illustrated the fact that they're so good at uptime. This is their business model. It's the same with Netflix. Chaos engineering, arguably a really important new field of engineering, was invented at Netflix because they know that people watching those shows freak out if it buffers, So certainly infrastructure companies of all kinds, Lee mentioned petroleum and those sorts of companies, they understand and their success stories. When things don't break, it's a success story. And it's usually because a team of people have put a lot of effort into making sure that the system and the service is reliable. So this is an area where, reliability engineering is another way to talk about these things. And there's, think of the aerospace industry or airlines, plastics, vaccines, any number of things where reliability and maintenance comes through and people depend on it every day. They probably don't even realize it, but they do.
I think, I can't speak for all those companies because we didn't interview folks at all those companies. But one thing that stands out, I think, is that a lot of these institutions that are good at maintenance, they also value that labor and the people who do it. So, I was talking to an engineer at Oracle about maintenance there, and a lot of plays, including like open source software and other areas, like maintenance is kind of the work of maintaining is not really valued. And so there's a lot of burnout and stuff, lack of recognition. I brought this up to him and he's like, oh, it's not like that here at all, right? Like a huge part of my job is maintaining this stuff and, the people I work with. And it's just seen as a really important, and it's not that surprising because Oracle realizes that that's its bottom line, right? So I think that I know, for instance, the chaos engineering characters at Netflix have had like pretty high profile careers. So I think that we would see that in these companies that really value it because they realize they're competing on uptime, you'd probably also see some different status things, and that's interesting.
So I wanted to pivot to something that we've kind of been circling around in a lot of these conversations, and that is the pandemic, because there is a lot of kind of maintenance, just basic maintenance, and also like profound innovation things that are coming out that are surfacing because of the pandemic. Can you just kind of talk to that a bit?
Go for it, Andy.
Sure. So, boy, where to start? First, the fact that we're doing this remotely, like many of us are doing everything remotely, and many jobs can go on. In our sector, education, it's not ideal, but we're persisting, and so there's something to be said about not only communication infrastructures, but power, gas, water infrastructures that have sustained many people. That the healthcare system in America has many problems, and there's been some job losses in the healthcare system. There's a lot of different maintenance angles. So we could talk about nurses, as we do in the book, as maintainers, of health. And nurses have been sacrificing a lot. And there's been some good stories recently about, well, they're not good stories, but they're well-written stories about burnout and exhaustion in healthcare workers. And yet, paradoxically, at the same time, their employers aren't doing a good job providing them with PPE or with any number of things that they need, to the point where there's strikes going on now in Albany down the road from me, as well as Philadelphia, I was reading about. and nurses are actually getting laid off as well, because the business models in the healthcare system is so messed up that that people not doing elective or routine surgeries mean that healthcare providers are losing money. The CARES Act gave them some of that money back, but apparently wasn't enough to compensate the nurses and healthcare workers who anywhere you look, they're heralded as heroes, but being laid off at the same time or furloughed. So there's that puzzling dilemma that the pandemic has brought out with that really important part of our lives.
Yeah, I think the other thing is just the whole notion of essential workers, many of whom are the kind of people we have been calling maintainers for 6 years now. And so, we didn't plan this pandemic, obviously, and to drop a book into it, but it has been, I think it's been speaking to a lot of people because they're kind of the pandemic has kind of surfaced this essential work that's going on all the time. I mean, I think the irony is that it's always essential, right? I always depend on the people working at the grocery store, but it's only in this crisis that it becomes clear how important it is. And I think, our only point is that we have to go beyond just recognition and putting up signs and stuff. There's a lot of these people who are doing essential work who need to be better compensated and given better benefits and such. And the only other thing like direct popping out of the pandemic has just been all these stories about terrible maintenance. So, we had a federal reserve of ventilators, for instance. And it turned out we couldn't use them because we hadn't been maintaining them for years on end. And so, it wasn't very surprising that kind of we had been abusing our health infrastructure, even though we'd been using federal money to build it up. So those are kind of like just obvious stories about lack of maintenance.
There's some kind of on the lighter side too that we keep bumping into both personally, and there's this hilarious story in the New York Times about these rich people moving to the Catskills and waiting till like November to get their firewood, or finding out how hard it is that to find carpenters or people who can help them make their homes more livable because the previous owner had deferred maintenance on it. But everybody I know is doing some kind of home improvement project, whether it's painting a room or, a Zoom studio, any number of things. So it's been interesting to both personally and amongst my friends and the things that I see online, watching people do some kind of home repair, home maintenance things.
That's been a fascinating story. Part of the pandemic is that story of the home repair thing, because I think, if you call, apparently this is true in lots of parts of the country, is that if you call, laborers, craftspeople in the trades and ask them to do something in your house, you're going to get put on a long waiting list. And it's because people are at home and the things that disappoint them about their houses are like in their face all the time. And they're also not going to Disney World or whatever, right? So like they're not spending that money in other ways. So it's really interesting. That's just kind of an unexpected but really fascinating story about repair and rehab and reno and all those things during the pandemic.
Yeah. So one of the concepts that you talk about in the book is the slow disaster. And so the pandemic, on the one hand, was very sudden. One day we were all living our lives. The next day we're locked down at home. But on the other hand, we could have seen this coming. Some people did see it coming. And, why didn't we pay more attention to the people who did see it coming?
Yeah, we get that concept from our friend Scott Knowles, who's a historian of disasters at Drexel. And, I think it's just a really powerful way of thinking about not investing in maintenance and repair and all these things and how things kind of creep up to you. And as we say in the book, the worst case scenario is when slow disaster, that is deferred maintenance, bumps into fast disaster, right? That's when the most deadly things happen. So you can think like Puerto Rico's electricity system, and then a hurricane comes through. and the question of why we're not better at paying attention to things that matter. I mean, I feel like this is like the crux of so many important fields of social science, is why we pay attention to the wrong things. Andy, I'll put that one on you.
Yeah, I've got all the answers. No, actually, I mean, I haven't. We were talking to David Brock at CHM last week, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about something that he said, which is that all of the investments that that the United States and arguably globally have been made in infrastructures that help vaccine development, public money, private money, an educated workforce, facilities, all these things, arguably the entire NIH's history, to be able to produce associations in companies now that have made vaccines that should be rolling out anytime, in record time, that's the consequence of an infrastructure that has been well attended to. Unlike the ones that Gene, you and Lee were talking about before, about the pandemic prevention group that really wasn't supported properly by the Trump administration. So there are, I think, some happy stories here, but it's not all good, and all that has come into pretty sharp relief. Who's been attending to the maintenance and reliability of their enterprises, and who hasn't?
Yeah, Gene, you were actually, I mean, it's really interesting thinking about vaccines as like innovation and maintenance. And you were actually bringing out some really interesting stories that Andy and I hadn't heard yet about startups being involved in all these things. And so there's really fascinating innovation story, but it's also just like about these systems that we've been building for decades, right? And all the money that we put into keeping them going. I think the way it comes out in a lot of conversations I see online about the vaccine is just cold storage and cold chains, and how much that kind of infrastructure of just fridges we're going to rely on for getting this thing out there into the world, right? I mean, so that's like maybe an infrastructure story, and many people don't think about the fridges in the world as infrastructure, but we're about to learn about it, right?
Right. Lots of dry ice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we, at Spectrum, we devoted an entire issue this fall to just engineering during the pandemic, and it is kind of astonishing. I mean, that all of these companies in so many different industries just, pivoted and immediately started working on whatever solution kind of they could. I mean, it wasn't just vaccines, it's like antivirals, it's rapid testing, it's contact tracing, it's ultraviolet light for disinfecting, all of these things, the modeling. And I guess, again, to play devil's advocate, if we spend a lot of time doing maintenance, will we kind of lose something on this, rapid innovation capacity?
I just can't see that risk. I don't think we're going to swing all the way, that we're going to become like some totally ossified culture where, where things are not going to change. And again, I think that all those things you're talking about, those are capacities that we've built up for generations. And that's why it's so important. That's the story, right? The story of standards and engineering training and all these things, how we build up these enormous systems that then allow us to do things. Just to get a little lightly abstractly political for a moment, I mean, the fact that corporations can do this shouldn't surprise us. We've done this during world wars. There's been other critical moments where the industry turns on a dime. And, it should open our eyes to possibilities around like climate change and all these other big things that we need to tackle. It is not impossible for corporations to tackle big problems when presented with them. And that's the kind of relationship between regulation and innovation. I think we need to think about how to use these capacities we built up towards positive ends.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to highlight. The other thing that popped to mind, Gene, in your question is that, is the undesirability of a world where maintenance rules all. And at the maintainers conferences and in the book, we talk about some negative examples of maintenance. And so just like we're not Luddites or innovation bashers, nor are we maintenance worshipers. We're not reactionaries who think that the world exactly as it is should be maintained. Maintenance has been used in the service of some terrible things. Whether it's apartheid in South Africa, Jim Crow in the U.S., you know, there's a number of things that that Lee and I don't think are desirable to maintain.
Coal burning power plants, we can put those to bed, right? I mean, I think that there's a bunch of systems we don't want to maintain in the world, but having this conversation, I think about, you know, again, about care and the things we are valuing allows us to say like, all right, what do we need to change and put to bed? But not presume that innovation or the new flashy thing is automatically going to solve racism or poverty or whatever for us. There's deeper conversations to be had there.
So I guess in terms of bringing more maintenance and more care into our lives, into our cultures, into our businesses, like what can any one person do? I mean, not just like an engineer who's working on a new thing, but like what can any of us do?
One of the concepts in the book and in the title of this event here is a maintenance mindset. Another way to think about that is what we like to call maintenance goggles. So seeing the world, seeing things and people around you through the lens of maintenance and care for maintainers. So a very simple thing that everyone can do today is say thank you. Say thank you to the people who are teachers, who are healthcare workers, who take your trash away. You know, any number of people who maintain your relatively comfortable life. Start by saying thank you, and then continue by thinking about how could I demonstrate my thanks to them beyond simple words, beyond that simple gesture. What would it mean to be part of a bigger solution to increase their compensation, increase and improve their access to healthcare, or simply sit down and listen and ask them what they would value and what would improve things for them. To take those humble steps. If everybody did that, I think we would see vast improvements in all the things that we've been talking about quickly. Lee, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I like the goggles metaphor is good. I think like there's different ways of ending books like this. And, you know, one way we could have ended it is by giving a bullet list of demands or something like that, like the 12 policies we want to see enacted. We chose not to end the book that way, but to really invite people to a conversation. So including just by going to the maintainers.org and joining the email server and taking part in, you know, actual conversations with other people. But I think it's about being in conversation about how to improve maintenance and maintain the lives of maintainers at every kind of level and in every institution in our society, in the organizations we work in, you know, including by creating awards and stuff like that in professional societies, you know, and thinking in terms of how to improve policy, you know, infrastructure policy by putting more federal money towards maintaining, less towards building new infrastructures, for instance, or finding ways to put politicians kind of on the hook, not just for, you know, like doing ribbon cuttings and smiling in front of new bridges, but to like put them on the hook for how well the subway is performing or whatever. So there's lots of conversations to be had for how to improve these parts of our culture.
And here's actually a question that came in from the audience who is, I guess, somebody who is more in the tech industry and asks, what would you like to see from our community, the technology and change maker organizations? What are some of the next steps we could start on?
Great question. I think, just to tie into the last discussion, to listen to the maintenance workforce and ask them what they want. Not like a demand sort of thing, but more in the mode of a conversation that Lee was talking about, and that gesture shows a level of respect. The other thing that worries me about, we have a little bit in the book about tech. I don't actually buy that the word tech is a useful category of much of anything. Software in the software industry and perceptions of it is just a terrible model for all kinds of things, because the costs of failure for startups, the cost of failure is so low. So I wish that people would stop looking at slogans like "move fast and break things" as exemplars for anything. It's not good for software. It's not good for bridges, as we document in the book, and it's not good for social interactions. It's not good for communities. So I think, to really revisit the people who we choose to put on a pedestal is something that the questioner and their colleagues could do.
I think the other thing is, the tech industry is so huge, but to the degree that the parts of it that are focused on the production of, cell phones and computers and gadgets of all sorts, electronics, I think there's a huge conversation to be had about how to move these companies in a more environmentally sustainable direction, and how to include maintainability and repair, and the long lives of cell phones as part of that business model.
What do you mean by that?
Well, just like, how does Apple move from a model where, for instance, Apple, to use one example, and I'm in other parts of my life, I do beat up on Apple, but I'm not meaning to do that right now. To use Apple as an example, they had a program where they replaced batteries because they had that whole thing where they were slowing down phones because of battery problems. So they offered to replace batteries. Well, people took them up on that offer, okay? And so they sold less phones that quarter or half a year or whatever it was. And then when Tim Cook wrote a letter saying we sold less phones because we were repairing more phones, their stock tanked for that moment. And so that raises really big questions about, electronics firms like Apple, and how they can move to more sustainable business models that aren't so fixated on turnover. That's what the kind of thing I mean.
We've actually been getting a lot of questions just about aspects of maintenance. You've struck a nerve here, guys. So one question came in about your reference to coal power. Maybe that's not something we necessarily want to maintain, but this person points out we can't just abandon it. It should be shut down gracefully and dismantled. Are those concepts part of a maintenance mindset?
Yeah, we did talk a bit about that at the end of the book. And that was from Stuart Marks, I think, who's an engineer at Oracle that I love talking to about these things. Yeah, I think that, it's really interesting looking at this issue in Europe as opposed to the States. So, we have the High Line in New York as an example of taking a rail line and turning it into something beautiful. In Europe, firms are actually on the hook for putting their plants and stuff to bed in a graceful way. And so in Germany, for instance, there's lots of places where heavy industry has been turned into these beautiful parks and stuff, right? And that they don't have the problem in the States of, where in the States we just abandon things and let them fall apart. So I do think, exactly like Stuart was saying there, not abandoning things, but learning how to put things to bed peacefully, including, if you think about the ring suburbs around Pittsburgh, where there's just houses collapsing on themselves, how to put places that are depopulating to bed peacefully is a really important conversation for us to have, and I think is especially an American conversation to have.
Yeah, not to put too fine a point on it, but one of the analogies that we like to use sometimes is hospice. So it's something, you know, we don't have to borrow from other cultures. It's very effective here, but it's that logic of putting things to bed peacefully and with dignity. It should be no problem to extend that logic and those practices to technological systems, you know, and so in the coal plants, that is not only the facility and all of the waste that presumably has polluted the grounds around it, but it's the people and communities whose livelihoods have depended on that facility probably for generations.
Yeah.
And it's not just to tell them to learn how to code, by the way. It needs a little bit more effort than that.
We're having these conversations right now. You know, we know the depopulated places of the country. You know, there's this book, Deaths of Despair by Case and Deaton, where, you know, more people are drinking themselves to death, committing suicide, doing all these terrible things who don't, basically white people who don't have college educations. You know, so our culture, American culture, has a real problem with dealing with this issue, not just with technology, but communities too. And, you know, it's a terrible injustice in our culture that it's this way.
So then, I mean, how do we kind of prioritize? How do we study and analyze and figure out, like, okay, where do we expend our resources, you know, even in terms of maintenance?
Mm.
I mean, you know, just look at the policies or even the way that people learn about economic change. So it's creative destruction, right? Like in Schumpeter's famous term, or the White House and the executive branch has all sorts of initiatives for entrepreneurship and innovation. I know that's a focus in the Bay Area there as well, is to really help communities of entrepreneurs. So imagine just a small percentage of that effort and of those resources going towards the kinds of things that we were talking about. Entering graceful periods of decline, if it's a certain region like the Rust Belt where I live, a decline or reinvention too, you know. But resources follow attention, and so we need to make sure we're convinced that there's a problem here worth paying attention to, and then the resources will follow.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I think that, you know, when we look at organizations, for instance, so often when we're making just decisions about buying new systems, the people who are going to be in charge of maintaining that thing down the road aren't even a part of the conversation, right? And so I think that I belong, you know, I'm most influenced by like skeptical schools of philosophy that say you're not going to create some general rule that's going to solve anyone's problems. That's the problem with consultants and you know, people like Christensen and stuff in part. But I think that what we're trying to aim for is having these conversations about maintenance and change include the maintainers, the people who are going to have to keep these things going, and thinking through those issues. So it's a more holistic decision. There's obviously going to always be really difficult trade-offs between doing the new thing and keeping other things going and valuing that, right? And especially, for instance, when firms are really afraid that they're going to be, I don't know, knocked over, disrupted, you know, when they feel at risk, there's so much incentive to do the new thing, because that's where the money, the profit, the growth is going to come from. So we're not saying that that's like and we can't do anything to make that tough decision go away, but we do want to kind of rebalance, you know, and have a more holistic conversation about, you know, how to deal with these trade-offs. And Andy's a dean, so he has to deal with this all the time in his professional life.
One person asked a question about the difference between innovation and invention. Is that a distinction that you guys make?
Yeah, I think Andy, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think we both like the traditional invention innovation story, you know, studies definition of an invention, the creation of a new idea. But inventions can just sit on shelves and never go anywhere. And innovations when inventions are then introduced and diffused through society. So that's kind of the classic way of thinking it. And then Andy likes to point out, traditionally, that diffusion is in the name of profit and creates profit. That's the kind of distinction we usually rely on.
Yeah, yeah. Innovation is I'm sorry, invention is typically viewed as a singular thing that may or may not go anywhere. Where innovation tends to be seen as more collaborative. I don't want to say invention is not collaborative. You know, so I'm being a little cagey there, but innovations generally get embedded into broader systems and yeah, for profit.
And then just to circle back to this idea of innovation speak, what I guess innovation speak tends to be often kind of come out of consultants' mouths. I mean, it's not something that engineers, for example, really would tend to use in everyday language. So
Yeah.
how does the rise of the consultant kind of feed into innovation speak?
If we can think about that chapter as a kind of theorization of innovation speak, I think the role of consultants is something we realized as we'd been working on this for a long time. It wasn't part of the original picture. What we did is we were looking at the history of our use of the word innovation. So if you go to like Google Ngram, a freely available tool on the internet, which you can put in words or phrases and it shows word use over time. If you put in innovation, it goes along from like 1800 until after World War II, and then it goes up and up and up. And now that they've updated it 2019, we know it continues to go up and up and up from like basically to the present, right? And so then as historians of kind of science and technology, what we wanted to do is write the history of that curve, basically. And so we went in and started looking at books and articles, and we're basically, just writing of like, what are people talking about when they talk about innovation? Who's doing it? Where's it coming from? And what we found is that, consultants just play a really important role in kind of like building up the bubble of hype around innovation. So people like Christensen was a Harvard Business School professor, but he had a consulting group called like InnoSight, where they would come put innovation goggles on you or something. There was like Richard Florida has his creative class idea that was supposed to engender innovation in cities. There's a design thinking folks at Stanford D School / IDEO, and we can go on and on. But the basic thing is, so many of these people, their business was really consulting. So I think sociologists find this in higher ed too, that like a lot of innovation talk comes from consultants going around to administrators. So for whatever reason, consultants are a really important vector for this way of talking and how it moves between different organizations and communities.
Can you talk a little bit about the idea of technical debt or technological debt? I believe it did come up in the book, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure. It comes from software, I think, is the first place where this metaphor comes from. And it's really just about what economists would call sunk costs, in that there's so much invested already in a deployed infrastructure that reckoning with that, the debt metaphor is useful for reckoning with that. We've found, and others have found, the debt metaphor also to be useful when thinking about infrastructure or technologies more general other than software. So if you think of infrastructural debt, you might think about a city like Lafayette, Louisiana, which we talk about in the book. Strong Towns, which is an engineering organization out of Minnesota, did a study of Lafayette and found that it had, Lee, you'll have to correct me on the numbers here, I think a $16 million tax base and $32 million worth of infrastructural debt, of obligations on the highways and roads that it would take to maintain those roads. So there's just no way they could pay for those things on themselves. And so it's a really useful metaphor in that way.
Yeah, we found that we found the debt metaphor, which originally came from computing and then traveled to other places in our minds. And so we found it a really helpful way to talk about these issues.
So I guess in terms of just sunk costs and things, when you think about a massive problem like climate change, I mean, how does the innovation versus maintenance, how does that play out when you're trying to tackle that big a problem?
Yeah, well, thank you for bringing that up. This is something we did tackle in the epilogue because we wanted to be sure people were not misunderstanding what we were saying. So first of all, we're not saying let's maintain everything. There's lots of coal burning power plants and other things we need to put to bed around the planet. Second of all, actual innovation, diffusion of new technology is going to be absolutely critical to dealing with climate change, you know, renewables and lots of other things, lots of basic things too, like winterizing and rehabbing houses and buildings would be really important. But finally, maintenance, it will play a really important role in dealing with the climate crisis. And that's for two reasons. First of all, you can imagine something like a Green New Deal where we just build up a bunch of systems and then we don't plan for their downstream costs and maintain them poorly. And then the related thing is that maintenance is really important for environmental sustainability, not just because it's important to keep things going for a long time if they're healthy things, but because better maintained systems use less energy, they produce less heat. And so, you know, in terms of buildings and all kinds of things, better maintained systems are more environmentally sustainable. So that's that for us. And then also some stuff, we also talk about racial injustice in that part of the book, but that for us is a key example for talking about the trade-off between actual innovation and maintenance.
Andy, you're nodding.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. Obviously, I was just thinking about one of the questions you asked before about how to, you know, what can we do with these ideas, and we write about a company, a software company that makes maintenance management software, where the founder said, we're a sustainability company. We're not, I mean, sure, we're a maintenance company, but we're really about its sustainability. And so, you know, it's maybe a little bit harder to get people to say, I'm a maintenance lover. But if you demonstrate to them, like what Lee just did, that the causes of maintenance and sustainability go hand in hand, then that broadens the audience, it fortifies the alliance. And so, you know, I think they're all big problems and they're all complex problems. So I think the more we understand that they're, you know, two sides of the same, you know, 12-sided die, the better off we'll be.
Yeah, Gene was talking about I don't know, can't remember, maybe Gene said rank and file, but I mean, we really love talking to professionals who do this stuff is one of the great pleasures of the book. And, you know, we've given talks at a couple conferences of maintenance professionals now, which is a real joy. But part of what, you know, we were also kind of being like ethnographers or something when we were there hanging out with these people. And it's really fascinating because they're middle managers mostly, and they're worried about two things: selling maintenance to their workers and like getting them on board with new ways of doing things, and then selling it up the ladder so that the executives really understand the value of maintenance, because they often don't, right? They're focused on other things. And in both those conversations, it goes along with what Andy was just saying. A lot of times they dress maintenance up in other things. So sometimes it's environmental sustainability, because that'll appeal to someone up the corporate chain, like the responsibility person. Or a lot of times in industry, it's safety. And I think in infrastructure, it can be safety too, which I think kind of says something about what the word maintenance does and doesn't do for people. If you have to like dress it up as something else to like sell it to people, I think kind of says like how we value it in our world.
Well, it's fair though to say you can talk about the consequences of poor maintenance, because in computing there's cybersecurity risks, for example, you know, or just simple outages, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, do you give advice to when you show up at these maintainers conferences? Do you give them advice on how they can like get the word out about the importance of what they do?
Yeah, I think we give them a narrative and to talk about things, but it's sometimes like the last one I gave, like I finished my talk, which is a lot of like the book, basically an outline of the book. And then at first, there was kind of quiet, and then a guy held up his hand in the back. He's like, "How did you even start looking at this?" And like for them, it's just like amazing that someone's even paying attention to what they're doing. Like it just blows them away. And so I think that a lot of times we end up being like, I don't know, cheerleader is the wrong metaphor or something, but like just like someone who sees them, and that's really valuable to them on their own, on its own.
Yeah, they know that they're doing good work. And there's a profession, there's a professional society for maintenance and reliability professionals. It goes sometimes by asset management is the method that they use for managing the assets. But most of all, I think it's useful for them to know, like Lee said, that people are paying attention and understand that they're doing the right thing, and understand that there's a bigger picture and they're contributing. And that's really important, is to I guess make that connection strong.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're getting to the end of our time together, but before we wrap up, as part of the Computer History Museum's One Word initiative, you were each asked to write down one word of advice for a young person starting out in their career. Can you each share your one word and the story behind why you chose it? Andy, you want to go first?
Sure. My one word is maintainers. The reason why I came to this is because anyone who's starting a company is themselves a maintainer. They have a maintenance role in their family, and they're providing and supporting people. And they've gotten to where they are because they have themselves been maintained. So we're all maintainers, and we're all maintained. And as anyone is jumping off on a new venture, I think it's really important for them to remember where they came from, who maintained them, and also to keep in mind that as they go forward, they're going to be responsible for maintaining other people and communities and the planet.
Yeah, and unsurprisingly, mine's related. I wrote down care. And I think that, Andy and I, we are very critical of innovation speak, but we're not bashers of actual innovation. And I think that care for me has become a really central concept for thinking about that balance, about introducing new things versus all the work that goes into just taking care of things around us. And when it comes to, young people, I teach engineers and scientists in classes as their, history of technology, sociology of technology professor. And what I want them to understand with care is that most likely these engineers and scientists are going to be going into maintainers roles when they graduate. They're not going to be innovators, and that's okay. That actually they're giving a lot of value back to our culture by taking care of the world around them and making sure that systems function for people. When electricity systems go down, people die, literally. So I think that, just thinking about caregiving as a role and a value and something they're giving to the world around them is really important. So that's what I try to give to them.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Jean, for doing this, by the way.
Yeah, thank you, Jean. You were great.
It was really my pleasure, guys. Lee and Andy, I guess we will turn things back over to David Brock.
Yeah.
Well, just to add my thanks again to you, Jean, Andy, and Lee for the great conversation, and thanks as well to everyone who joined us for it. Everybody can maintain this kind of programming by connecting with the museum at computerhistory.org/subscribe, or by becoming a supporter at computerhistory.org/join. Goodbye.